Some stories challenge everything you believe about life, death, and the invisible forces that protect us. If you're someone who knows that miracles aren't fairy tales, but documented reality that mainstream media refuses to investigate, then what I'm about to share will forever change your understanding of guardian angels. January 15th, 2025, 11:47 p.m. Detroit's 27th Street cuts through the city like a scar, where abandoned buildings cast shadows over broken dreams and shattered glass crunches under desperate footsteps. The bitter Michigan wind carries the scent of rust and desperation, while flickering streetlights struggle against the darkness that has claimed this forgotten corner of America. Daniel Richardson's midnight blue Tesla sits motionless under a dying street lamp, its engine silent, its owner trapped inside a nightmare he never saw coming. Steam rises from under the hood like ghostly fingers reaching toward the star-scattered sky, while the leather seats still hold the warmth of a man whose billion-dollar empire suddenly means nothing against three loaded guns pointed at his chest. The attackers emerged from the shadows like predators sensing weakness, their faces hidden behind torn bandanas, their voices rough with the desperation of men with nothing left to lose. The metallic click of weapons being loaded echoes off abandoned storefronts, mixing with Daniel's rapid breathing as he realizes his fortune cannot buy him safety in this moment of absolute terror. But at exactly 11:47 p.m., when death seemed inevitable and prayer felt useless, something impossible happened. A figure stepped out from the darkness between two collapsed buildings, moving with otherworldly grace across the broken pavement. A teenage girl, no more than 16, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold starlight and courage that defied her fragile appearance. Her voice cut through the night air with supernatural authority, creating a distraction that would save Daniel's life and begin a journey into impossible that would shake the foundations of everything he believed about reality, death, and the angels that walk among us. What happened next in those crucial seconds would launch an investigation that would uncover hospital records, death certificates, and security footage that prove some guardians never stop protecting us, even from beyond the grave. This is the documented true story of Grace Michelle Santos, the angel of 27th Street, who sacrificed 3 years ago, continues to save lives in ways that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the thin veil between heaven and earth. Daniel Richardson had built his empire on precision. Every decision calculated, every risk measured, every outcome predicted by algorithms that had made him the youngest tech billionaire in Michigan's history. But at 11:43 p.m. on January 15, 2025, precision meant nothing when his Tesla's engine suddenly died in the heart of Detroit's most dangerous neighborhood. The silence hit him first. The gentle hum of the electric motor that had carried him through countless board meetings and million-dollar negotiations simply stopped, leaving him surrounded by the kind of quiet that makes your heartbeat sound like thunder. Outside his tinted windows, 27th Street stretched in both directions like a wound through the city's flesh, lined with buildings that bore the scars of abandonment and windows that stared blindly into the night. He'd taken this shortcut hundreds of times before, racing between his downtown penthouse and the suburban tech campus where his company, Richardson Dynamics, developed artificial intelligence systems for Fortune 500 companies. The irony wasn't lost on him now, sitting helpless in a car controlled by the same type of technology that had made him rich. Watching the dashboard display flash error messages in cheerful blue letters that felt like mockery, the January cold seeped through the metal frame despite the heated leather seats, carrying with it the scent of rust, decay, and something else he couldn't identify but instinctively feared. Broken glass from 1,000 forgotten incidents crunched under the tires of passing cars, their headlights casting brief shadows that moved across his windshield, like fingers reaching for something they'd never touch. Daniel's phone showed full bars, but when he tried calling for roadside assistance, the call dropped immediately. Emergency services gave him a busy signal. His personal security team, stationed 20 minutes away in their climate-controlled office, might as well have been on another planet. For the first time in 15 years, Daniel Richardson was truly alone. That's when he saw them. Three figures emerged from the alley between a collapsed liquor store and a building, whose windows had been boarded up so long that graffiti covered the wood like urban cave paintings. They moved with the practiced stealth of predators, their footsteps silent against the broken pavement, their dark clothing making them nearly invisible against the shadows that seemed to embrace them like old friends. The first man approached from the driver's side, his face hidden behind a torn bandana that had once been blue but now looked black in the dim streetlight. His hands moved with mechanical precision, one reaching into a jacket pocket while the other gestured toward his companions with the fluid communication of a team that had done this before. Daniel's mouth went dry as desert sand. His hands, which had signed billion-dollar contracts without trembling, now shook as he reached for the door locks that had already engaged automatically when the car sensed the approaching figures. The soft click of the locking mechanism sounded as final as a coffin lid closing. The second attacker circled toward the passenger side, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air that caught the streetlight like tiny ghosts. Through the tinted glass, Daniel could see the outline of something metallic glinting in the man's right hand, something that made his chest tighten with primal fear that no amount of money or success had prepared him to face. But it was the third figure that made Daniel's blood turn to ice water in his veins. Smaller than the others, moving with a desperate energy that spoke of addiction and desperation. This one carried something that reflected the streetlight in a way that left no doubt about its purpose. The metallic surface caught the amber glow and threw it back like a deadly star, while the sound of metal sliding against metal cut through the night air with surgical precision. They surrounded his Tesla like wolves, circling wounded prey, their movements coordinated with the efficiency of professionals who had reduced human terror to a simple business transaction. The first man raised his weapon, pointing it directly at the driver's side window with steady hands that spoke of experience Daniel wished he didn't have to contemplate. The glass that separated Daniel from death suddenly felt as thin as paper. His billion-dollar empire, his penthouse with views of the Detroit River, his collection of rare art and vintage wines, all of it meaningless against three pieces of metal that could end his story in seconds. That's when she appeared, at exactly 11:47 p.m., according to the timestamp that would later be analyzed by forensic experts and paranormal investigators. A figure stepped out from the darkness between two buildings directly across from Daniel's trapped Tesla. Even through his panic, even with his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom, Daniel felt something shift in the air around him. The girl couldn't have been more than 16 years old, her slight frame barely visible against the backdrop of urban decay. But she moved with a confidence that seemed to bend reality around her presence. Her long dark hair caught the streetlight like spun silk, and her clothes, though clearly worn and weathered by life on the streets, somehow seemed to glow with their own inner light. But it was her eyes that stopped Daniel's world from spinning, even from 30 feet away, even through the tinted glass and terror that clouded his vision. Those eyes pierced through everything else like blue flames cutting through darkness. They held depths that seemed ancient wisdom that belonged to someone far older than her teenage face suggested, and a compassion that made Daniel understand, in that impossible moment, that he was looking at something beyond ordinary human experience. The girl stepped into the street with movements that defied the laws of physics he thought he understood. Her bare feet made no sound against the broken asphalt, and the freezing January wind that had been howling through the abandoned buildings suddenly stilled to perfect silence, as if nature itself was holding its breath to witness what was about to unfold. The three attackers turned toward her in unison, their weapons shifting away from Daniel's car toward this new presence that had somehow appeared in their carefully planned hunting ground. The girl raised one small hand toward them, and Daniel swore he could see light emanating from her palm, though every rational part of his mind insisted that was impossible. What happened next would be captured by 7 different security cameras from surrounding businesses, analyzed by digital forensics experts. and studied by paranormal researchers who would spend years trying to explain the unexplainable. But in that moment, Daniel Richardson, the man who had built his fortune on logic and predictable outcomes, witnessed something that would shatter every assumption he'd ever made about the nature of reality itself. The girl's voice cut through the frozen night air, with an authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. Her words weren't shouted or screamed, but spoken with a quiet power that made the three-armed men stop in their tracks as if they'd walked into an invisible wall. "You don't want to do this," she said. And her voice carried harmonics that made the broken glass on the street vibrate like wind chimes touched by an otherworldly breeze. "This man has work to do. Important work that will save many lives." The first attacker, the one whose weapon had been pointed at Daniel's window just seconds before, slowly lowered his gun as if his arm was being guided by forces he couldn't control. His eyes, visible above the torn bandana, showed confusion mixed with something Daniel had never expected to see in the face of a street criminal: reverence. "Who are you?" the man whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of distant traffic and the gentle rustling of papers blown by, wind that had mysteriously returned to the scene. The girl smiled, and Daniel felt warmth spread through his chest despite the January cold that had been seeping into his bones just moments before. Her smile held the kind of peace that people spend lifetimes searching for, the kind of serenity that meditation masters and spiritual teachers only achieve after decades of practice. "I'm someone who protects people who can't protect themselves," she replied, taking another step forward. With each movement, the streetlight above seemed to grow brighter, casting longer shadows that danced around her feet like living things. "And I'm someone who believes that everyone deserves a second chance to choose love over fear. If you're still with me at this point, it means you're exactly the kind of person who understands that reality is far more magical than we've been taught." There's a growing community of us here who recognize that these aren't coincidences, they're miracles. Subscribe to this channel because what happens next in this impossible story is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about guardian angels. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single detail of how this encounter unfolds into something that will shake the foundations of everything Daniel believed about life and death. The second attacker, the one who had been circling toward the passenger side of Daniel's Tesla, dropped his weapon entirely. The metallic clatter echoed off the abandoned buildings like a bell tolling the end of violence. And Daniel watched in amazement as the man's aggressive posture melted into something resembling shame. "I'm sorry," the man said, though Daniel couldn't tell if he was speaking to the girl, to Daniel himself, or to some higher power that had suddenly made itself known in this forgotten corner of Detroit. "We didn't know. We just needed money for my daughter's medicine." The girl nodded with understanding that seemed to encompass not just this moment, but the entire chain of circumstances that had led these desperate men to this desperate act. "I know," she said, reaching into a pocket of her worn jacket. "And she's going to be fine." What she pulled out defied every law of physics and economics that Daniel thought he understood. From a jacket that couldn't possibly have contained anything of value, the girl produced a roll of bills thick enough to choke a horse. The money looked crisp and new, as if it had just been printed, and it seemed to glow with the same otherworldly light that surrounded the girl herself. She handed the money to the first attacker, the one who had been ready to end Daniel's life just minutes before. "Take this to Detroit Children's Hospital," she said. "Tell them it's for Sarah Martinez's treatment. Room 347. They'll know what to do." The man's hands shook as he accepted the money, and Daniel could see tears streaming down his face above the bandana. "How did you know her name?" he whispered. "How did you know about Sarah?" The girl's smile grew even brighter, and for a moment Daniel swore he could see wings made of pure light spreading behind her shoulders. Though when he blinked, they were gone, leaving him to wonder if his mind was playing tricks on him, or if he was witnessing something that would require him to rewrite everything he thought he knew about the possible. "I know because someone who loves you very much asked me to watch over your family," she said. "Your mother, Maria Martinez." She's been praying for you every night since she passed away 3 years ago. The third attacker, the smallest one who had been carrying the weapon that gleamed like a deadly star, suddenly collapsed to his knees on the broken pavement. His sobs echoed off the abandoned buildings like a symphony of redemption, mixing with the sound of sirens in the distance that seemed to be growing closer. "Mama," the man whispered, looking up at the girl with eyes that held the wonder of a child seeing magic for the first time. "She said she would send an angel to help us when we needed it most." The girl knelt down beside him, placing her hand on his shoulder with a gentleness that made the harsh streetlight seem warm and soft. "She kept her promise," she said, "and now you need to keep yours. It's a promise you made to her on her deathbed. Do you remember?" Daniel watched from inside his Tesla as the man nodded, fresh tears streaming down his face. "I promised I would take care of my brothers. I promised I would keep the family together. Then go," the girl said, helping him to his feet with strength that seemed impossible for someone so small. "Go to your brothers. Tell them about tonight. Tell them that love is stronger than desperation, and that there are always other options for people brave enough to look for them." The three men gathered their weapons, but instead of running away or trying to complete their original plan, they approached Daniel's car. The first one, the leader who had been ready to kill him just minutes before, tapped gently on the driver's side window. Daniel hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the door unlock button. But something in the man's eyes had changed completely. Where there had been desperation and violence just minutes before, there was now something that looked almost like gratitude mixed with shame. He lowered the window just a crack, enough to hear but not enough to be vulnerable if this was some kind of elaborate trick. "I'm sorry, sir," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "We never should have done this. We were scared and desperate, but that's no excuse for what we almost did to you." "The girl," Daniel said, his voice hoarse from fear and amazement. "Who is she?" The three men turned to look at the spot where the girl had been standing just seconds before. But Daniel's heart sank as he realized what he was seeing. The space between the abandoned buildings was empty. No trace of the teenage girl who had just performed what could only be described as a miracle. No footprints in the dust. No indication that anyone had been there at all. "She was right there," the second attacker said, his voice filled with the same confusion Daniel was feeling. "She was just talking to us. She gave us the money." But when they looked down at their hands, the roll of bills was gone too. In its place, each man held a small piece of paper with an address written in elegant handwriting that seemed to shimmer in the streetlight. The same address, Detroit Children's Hospital, room 347. "How is that possible?" Daniel whispered. But the three men were already walking away, their footsteps echoing off the abandoned buildings as they disappeared into the same shadows from which they had emerged. Daniel sat alone in his Tesla, his hands still shaking, his mind trying to process what he had just witnessed. The engine suddenly hummed to life, the dashboard lights returning to their normal, cheerful blue glow, as if the car had never been broken down at all. But as he put the car in drive and slowly pulled away from 27th Street, Daniel Richardson knew that his life had just been changed forever by something that defied every logical explanation he could imagine. He had been saved by a guardian angel, and now he had to find out who she was and how he could possibly thank someone who had vanished into thin air like morning mist touched by sunlight. For the next 72 hours, Daniel Richardson became a man obsessed. He hired Marcus Webb, Detroit's most expensive private investigator, a former FBI agent whose specialty was finding people who didn't want to be found. He posted reward notices on every social media platform, offering $50,000 for information about the mysterious girl who had saved his life on 27th Street. The response was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Hundreds of messages poured in from people who had seen a teenage girl matching her description throughout Detroit's homeless community. But as Marcus began investigating each lead, a disturbing pattern emerged that made Daniel's blood run cold. "Mr. Richardson," Marcus said during their meeting at Daniel's downtown office, his weathered face showing the kind of concern that comes from 30 years of investigating cases that didn't make sense. I've been tracking missing persons and cold cases for 3 decades, and I've never seen anything like this. Marcus spread a collection of photographs across Daniel's mahogany desk, each one showing security camera footage from different locations throughout Detroit. Gas stations, convenience stores, bus stops, hospital parking lots. In each grainy image, a teenage girl with long dark hair could be seen helping someone in distress. "This is from October 15th, 2023, Marcus said, pointing to a photograph that showed the girl helping an elderly man who had collapsed outside a pharmacy. "This one is from March 22nd, 2024, outside Detroit General Hospital, where she apparently guided a lost ambulance to the emergency entrance during a blackout." Daniel studied each image with growing amazement. The girl looked exactly the same in every photograph. Same clothes, same height, same ethereal presence that seemed to make her glow even in the poor quality security footage. "And this," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "is from December 8th, 2024, just 5 weeks ago. She stopped a drunk driver from hitting a school bus full of children by standing directly in front of his car. Witnesses said the car should have killed her instantly, but when the dust settled, she was gone and the children were safe." "Has anyone actually spoken with her?" Daniel asked, though something in Marcus's expression was already telling him the answer. "That's where this gets really strange, sir," Marcus replied, pulling out a thick folder filled with witness statements. "I've interviewed 47 people who claim to have interacted with her directly. They all describe the same thing. She appears when someone is in mortal danger. She intervenes in ways that shouldn't be possible, and then she vanishes without a trace." Marcus paused, running his hand through his gray hair in a gesture that spoke of deep frustration. "But here's the thing that's keeping me awake at night. I decided to run her physical description through the missing persons database, and then through the county coroner's records, just to be thorough." Daniel felt his chest tighten with anticipation, though he couldn't have explained why. "I found a match," Marcus said quietly. "Grace Michelle Santos, age 16, died January 15th, 2022, at 11:47 p.m. The silence in Daniel's office became so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Detroit's skyline sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. But inside this room, reality itself seemed to be shifting on its foundation. "That's impossible," Daniel whispered, though even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. Nothing about his encounter on 27th Street had been possible. Yet it had happened anyway. Marcus opened the folder and pulled out a death certificate that looked official enough to be accepted in any court of law. The Michigan State seal was clearly visible, along with the signatures of a coroner, a doctor, and a police officer who had pronounced Grace Michelle Santos dead at exactly 11:47 p.m. on January 15th, 2022. According to the police report, Marcus continued, his voice steady despite the impossibility of what he was saying. Grace was killed during a robbery attempt on 27th Street. She was trying to protect a stranger, a businessman whose car had broken down, when 3 armed men attacked them both. Daniel's hands began to shake as the implications of what Marcus was telling him sank in like stones dropping into still water. "Where exactly on 27th Street?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Marcus pulled out a police diagram that showed the exact location of Grace's death. The spot was marked with a small X, and Daniel felt the world tilt sideways as he realized he was looking at the precise coordinates where his Tesla had broken down 3 nights ago. "She died in the exact same place where you say she saved your life," Marcus said quietly. 3 years to the day, at the exact same time, protecting a stranger from the exact same type of attack. The folder contained everything that documented the end of Grace Michelle Santos's earthly life. Hospital records showing the bullet wound that had pierced her heart. Photographs from the crime scene that showed her small body lying on the broken pavement of 27th Street. Statements from paramedics who had tried desperately to save her life, as she bled out under the same streetlight that had illuminated Daniel's impossible rescue. But it was the final document in the folder that made Daniel understand he was dealing with something far beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. It was a handwritten statement from Father Miguel Rodriguez, the priest who had administered Grace's last rites as she died in the ambulance on the way to Detroit General Hospital. Her final words, Daniel read aloud, his voice breaking as he spoke, were a prayer asking God to let her continue protecting innocent people from harm, even after death. Marcus nodded grimly. According to Father Rodriguez, Grace Santos spent her last moments on earth, praying not for her own life, but for the safety of strangers she would never meet. Daniel stared at the death certificate until the words blurred together, his mind struggling to process the impossible truth that was staring him in the face. The girl who had saved his life, who had spoken with otherworldly authority and produced money from thin air, who had known details about the attackers that no living person could have known, had been dead for exactly 3 years. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a small plastic evidence bag. The crime scene investigators found this clutched in Grace's hand when she died. Inside the bag was a small silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful. Through the clear plastic, Daniel could see an engraving on the front that made his breath catch in his throat. The engraving read, "Guardian Angel, 27th Street. Mr. Richardson," Marcus said, his voice filled with the kind of awe that comes from encountering something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world. "I think you were saved by someone who's been dead for 3 years. And based on these witness reports, I think she's been saving people all over Detroit ever since she died." Daniel looked up from the evidence bag, his eyes meeting Marcus's across the desk. "What does that make her?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the Detroit skyline as if he might find answers written in the glass and steel of the city's towers. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 30 years spent solving cases that defied explanation. "I think it makes her exactly what she said she was," Marcus replied. "A guardian angel who keeps her promises even from beyond the grave." Daniel's investigation into Grace Santos became a journey that transformed him from a skeptical businessman into someone willing to explore territories that science couldn't explain. He hired Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic digital analyst from MIT, to examine every frame of security footage that had captured Grace's appearances throughout Detroit. "Mr. Richardson," Dr. Chen said during their video conference, her voice filled with the kind of scientific bewilderment that comes from encountering data that shouldn't exist. "I've analyzed 17 different video sources using the most advanced facial recognition and motion analysis software available. The results are impossible." Dr. Chen's computer screen filled with enhanced footage from the night Daniel was saved. Frame by frame, she walked him through the digital evidence that defied every law of physics she understood. "Watch this carefully," she said, slowing the footage to 1 frame per second. "This is the moment Grace steps out from between the buildings. Notice how the ambient lighting changes around her. The streetlight above grows brighter, but only in her immediate vicinity." Daniel watched in fascination as the enhanced footage revealed details his naked eye had missed during the actual encounter. Grace seemed to emit her own light source, a soft golden glow that made the shadows retreat from her presence like living things afraid of illumination. "Now watch this," Dr. Chen continued, advancing to the moment when Grace had produced the money for the attackers. "According to the laws of conservation of matter, what you're about to see is impossible." The slow-motion footage showed Grace reaching into her jacket pocket, but the thermal imaging overlay revealed something that made Daniel's scientific worldview crumble completely. Her hand disappeared into a pocket that registered as having infinite depth, reaching into a space that existed outside the normal dimensions of physical reality. "The thermal signature shows her hand entering what I can only describe as a portal," Dr. Chen explained, her voice tight with controlled amazement. The temperature readings at the edge of her pocket dropped to absolute 0, which should be physically impossible for any material to withstand. But it was the audio analysis that provided the most compelling evidence of Grace's supernatural nature. Dr. Chen had isolated Grace's voice from the ambient street noise and run it through harmonic analysis software used by paranormal researchers. "Listen to this," she said, playing Grace's voice through specialized speakers that could reproduce frequencies beyond normal human hearing. Her voice contains harmonic overtones that exist in ranges typically associated with angelic communication in religious texts. Daniel heard his own voice on the recording, tight with fear and very obviously human. But when Grace spoke, her words carried undertones that seemed to resonate in frequencies that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. The harmonics match patterns documented in near-death experiences where patients reported hearing angelic voices. Dr. Chen continued, "But Mr. Richardson, this is a living recording of those same harmonic signatures, which means either our understanding of physics is completely wrong, or you encountered something that exists outside the normal boundaries of human experience." Daniel's next step was to visit Grace's family, a decision that required more courage than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. The Santos family lived in a modest house in Detroit's Corktown district, where Grace's younger brother, Miguel, and her grandmother, Alina, still maintained a shrine to her memory in their living room. Senator Richardson, Alina Santos said in heavily accented English, her weathered hands gesturing toward photographs of Grace that covered an entire wall. "Me Nita was special from the day she was born. She always saw things others couldn't see." Alina was 73 years old, a woman whose eyes held the depth of someone who had witnessed both profound loss and inexplicable miracles. She served Daniel coffee in delicate china cups that seemed too beautiful for the humble surroundings, and spoke about Grace with the reverence typically reserved for saints. When Grace was 7 years old, Alina continued, she saved her little brother from drowning in the Detroit River. But Miguel, he told us that Grace pulled him out of water that was too deep for her to stand in. The lifeguards, they found Miguel on the shore completely dry, while Grace was soaking wet. They never could explain how she got him out. Miguel Santos, now 19 years old and working as a mechanic to support his grandmother, joined their conversation with eyes that held the same otherworldly depth Daniel had seen in Grace's face. "My sister always said she could hear voices that other people couldn't hear," Miguel explained. "Angels," she called them. They would tell her when someone was in danger, and she would go help them, even if it meant putting herself at risk. Alina nodded sadly. "The night she died, Grace told me she had to go out because the voices were calling her. They said someone needed her help on 27th Street. I begged her not to go, but she said it was her purpose, her calling." "What happened that night?" Daniel asked gently, though he wasn't sure he was ready to hear the answer. Miguel's expression darkened with pain that was still fresh after 3 years. "She found a businessman whose car had broken down. 3 men were trying to rob him. Grace stepped in to protect him, just like she always did. But this time, the men were too desperate, too dangerous." Alina reached for a small wooden box on the table beside her chair, opening it to reveal the personal effects that had been returned to the family after Grace's death. Among them was a journal with entries written in Grace's careful handwriting. "She wrote in this every day," Alina said, handing the journal to Daniel with shaking hands. "Read the last entry. It was written the morning she died." Daniel opened the journal to the final page, where Grace's words seemed to glow on the paper as if they held their own inner light. January 15th, 2022. "The angels are calling me stronger than ever today. They're showing me a vision of a man in a dark car who will need protection tonight. I don't know what will happen to me, but I know I have to be there. If something happens to me, I pray that God will let me continue helping people even after I'm gone. I pray that death won't stop me from answering when someone needs a guardian angel." Daniel's hands trembled as he read Grace's final words, written with the prophetic certainty of someone who somehow knew her earthly mission was about to end. But her spiritual work was just beginning. "Senator Richardson," Alina said quietly, "tell me about the night Grace saved you. Tell me everything." Daniel recounted every detail of his encounter, from the moment his car broke down to Grace's disappearance into thin air. As he spoke, Elena's eyes filled with tears that seemed to catch and reflect light that wasn't visible in the modest living room. She kept her promise, Elena whispered. Minita found a way to keep protecting people, even from heaven. Miguel leaned forward, his eyes intense with emotion. Mr. Richardson, you're not the first person who's come here with a story like this. In the past 3 years, 17 different people have contacted us. All of them saved by a teenage girl with long dark hair and blue eyes who appeared when they needed help most, then vanished without explanation. Elena stood and walked to the shrine, touching a photograph of Grace with reverence that made Daniel understand he was in the presence of something sacred. My granddaughter was chosen for this work, she said. Even in death, she continues to answer God's call to protect the innocent. As Daniel prepared to leave the Santos home, Elena pressed something into his hand. It was a small silver cross that had belonged to Grace, worn smooth by years of faithful handling. She would want you to have this, Elena said, and she would want you to know that your life was saved for a reason. Grace didn't sacrifice herself just to protect you from those men. She saved you because you have important work to do. Daniel looked down at the cross, feeling its weight in his palm like a promise he didn't yet understand, but knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to fulfill. Outside, the Detroit skyline gleamed in the afternoon sun. But Daniel Richardson was no longer the same man who had built his empire on logic and predictable outcomes. He was a man who had been touched by grace itself, and now he had to figure out what that meant for the rest of his life. The transformation of Daniel Richardson from ruthless tech mogul to guardian of Detroit's forgotten began exactly 1 month after his encounter with Grace Santos. On February 15, 2025, he stood on the same corner of 27th Street where his life had been saved. But this time, he wasn't alone. Construction crews worked around the clock to build the Grace Santos Emergency Shelter, a state-of-the-art facility that would provide food, medical care, and safe housing for Detroit's homeless population. But this wasn't just another corporate charity project designed to generate positive press coverage. This was Daniel's mission, his calling, his response to the impossible gift he had been given. Mr. Richardson, said Maria Gonzalez, the shelter's director and a former social worker who had dedicated her life to serving Detroit's most vulnerable residents. I've never seen anything like this. We've got funding for the next 10 years, medical equipment that rivals Detroit General Hospital, and a waiting list of volunteers that stretches for blocks. Daniel smiled as he watched volunteers unloading supplies from trucks that seemed to arrive every hour, filled with donations from people who had heard Grace's story and wanted to be part of the miracle that was growing on 27th Street. Word had spread through social media, local news, and the kind of grassroots network that emerges when something genuinely sacred touches a community that has forgotten how to hope. It's not me doing this, Maria, Daniel replied, touching the silver cross that now hung around his neck, the one Elena Santos had given him from Grace's personal effects. I'm just following instructions. Those instructions had come in dreams, vivid encounters where Grace appeared to Daniel with the same radiant presence he had witnessed on the night she saved his life. In these dreams, she showed him visions of what 27th Street could become, a beacon of hope in a neighborhood that had been abandoned by prosperity, but not by grace. The shelter opened its doors on March 15th, exactly 2 months after Daniel's encounter with his guardian angel. But what happened on opening day defied every expectation and challenged the understanding of everyone who witnessed it. Father Miguel Rodriguez, the same priest who had administered Grace's last rites 3 years earlier, was there to bless the new facility. As he spoke the words of consecration over the building, every person present reported seeing the same impossible phenomenon. I saw her, whispered James Morrison, 60-year-old veteran who had been living on Detroit streets for 8 years. Grace was standing right there behind Father Rodriguez, smiling like she was proud of what we'd built. The testimonies were consistent and overwhelming. 43 people, including Daniel himself, watched as Grace's spirit appeared during the blessing ceremony, visible for nearly 5 minutes before fading away like morning mist touched by sunlight. Security cameras captured the entire event, though the footage showed only a bright, ethereal glow where witnesses reported seeing Grace's full form. But Grace's presence in the shelter extended far beyond that single miraculous appearance. Over the following months, residents and staff reported encounters that could only be described as divine intervention. Sarah Chen, a former addict who had been living in abandoned buildings for 3 years, was the first to experience Grace's ongoing protection. "I was having a panic attack in my room, ready to go back to the streets and back to the drugs," Sarah explained during a community meeting 6 months after the shelter opened. "Then I felt someone sit down on my bed and take my hand. I looked up and saw Grace, clear as day, telling me I was safe and that my daughter needed me to stay strong." Sarah's transformation became legendary among the shelter residents. She enrolled in a nursing program, reconnected with her estranged daughter, and eventually became the shelter's peer counselor, helping other residents navigate their own journeys from desperation to hope. But it was the night of December 8, 2025, that proved Grace's protection extended beyond the shelter walls to encompass the entire neighborhood around 27th Street. A gas leak in the basement of an abandoned building threatened to explode, potentially killing dozens of residents in the surrounding area. Emergency crews arrived to find that every person in the danger zone had been safely evacuated, led to safety by what witnesses described as a teenage girl with long dark hair who seemed to glow in the darkness. Fire Chief Robert Martinez, a 30-year veteran of Detroit's emergency services, submitted an official report that would become part of the permanent record. "I've never seen anything like it," Chief Martinez wrote. "Every resident in a 6-block radius was standing safely outside the evacuation zone when we arrived, but none of them could explain how they had been warned about the gas leak. They all reported being awakened by the same teenage girl who told them to leave immediately." Security footage from that night showed something that defied scientific explanation. The cameras captured people leaving their homes and walking toward safety. But they also captured something else: a luminous figure moving from building to building, apartment to apartment, somehow entering locked doors and awakening sleeping residents, who had no way of knowing about the impending disaster. The explosion, when it came, destroyed 3 abandoned buildings but harmed no one. Not a single person was injured, despite the fact that on any other night, dozens of homeless individuals and families would have been sleeping in those buildings. Daniel Richardson stood among the crowd of evacuated residents, watching the flames consume buildings that should have been filled with victims, and understood that Grace's promise to protect innocent people had been fulfilled once again. 1 year after the shelter opened, Daniel established the Grace Santos Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to replicating the 27th Street miracle in cities across America. But the foundation's work extended beyond providing shelter and services. It became a center for documenting and studying angelic interventions, creating a database of supernatural encounters that challenged traditional understanding of life, death, and the nature of divine protection. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, a theological scholar from Harvard Divinity School, joined the foundation as its research director after investigating Grace's story for her doctoral thesis on modern miracles. "What we're documenting here isn't just one isolated incident," Dr. Thompson explained during a conference that brought together researchers, theologians, and witnesses from around the world. Grace Santos represents a new understanding of how love transcends the boundaries of death. Her story proves that some souls are so committed to service that not even death can stop their mission. The conference, held in the main hall of the Grace Santos Emergency Shelter, was attended by representatives from 12 different countries, all reporting similar encounters with guardian angels who appeared to protect innocent people in moments of mortal danger. But for Daniel Richardson, the most meaningful moment came not during the international conference or the media attention that followed Grace's story around the world. It came on a quiet Tuesday evening in November, exactly 2 years after his life-changing encounter. Daniel was walking through the shelter, checking on residents and reviewing the day's activities, when he felt a familiar presence behind him. He turned to see Grace standing in the hallway, as real and solid as she had been on the night she saved his life. "You kept your promise," Grace said, her voice carrying the same otherworldly harmonics that Dr. Chen had documented in her scientific analysis. "You turned your rescue into a mission to rescue others." Daniel felt tears streaming down his face as he looked into the eyes of the angel who had changed everything he believed about the possible. "I had a good teacher," he replied. Grace smiled with radiance that filled the entire hallway with warmth and light. "This is just the beginning, Daniel. Your work here will inspire others to build shelters and foundations around the world. Love multiplies when it's shared, and grace grows stronger when it's given away." "Will I see you again?" Daniel asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "You see me every time you help someone who can't help themselves," Grace replied. "You see me every time you choose love over fear, service over profit, hope over despair." "I'm not going anywhere, Daniel. I'm exactly where I've always been, right here protecting the people who need protection most." As Grace faded from view, Daniel understood that his encounter with an angel had been just the beginning of a transformation that would ripple outward from 27th Street to touch lives around the world. He had been saved not just from death, but for a purpose that would define the rest of his life. The Grace Santos's emergency shelter continued to operate with miraculous effectiveness, serving over 3,000 individuals in its first 2 years and maintaining a 94% success rate for helping residents transition to permanent housing and stable employment. But the numbers, impressive as they were, couldn't capture the real miracle of what had been built on 27th Street. The real miracle was the transformation of a forgotten corner of Detroit into a place where hope lived, where love conquered fear, and where the impossible happened so regularly that residents and staff learned to accept grace as a normal part of daily life. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right through the trees that had been planted around the shelter's gardens, visitors could sometimes hear the sound of gentle laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The laughter of a teenage girl who had kept her promise to continue protecting innocent people, even from beyond the grave. 3 years after Grace Santos saved Daniel Richardson's life from beyond the grave, the impossible had become possible on 27th Street. Crime rates in the surrounding neighborhood had dropped by 87%. Property values had risen, but not in a way that displaced existing residents. Instead, new businesses opened specifically to serve the community that had grown around the Grace Santos Emergency Shelter. Dr. Patricia Williams, a sociologist from the University of Michigan, spent 2 years studying what became known as the 27th Street phenomenon for her research on the intersection of spirituality and urban renewal. "What we're seeing here defies every model of urban development I've studied," Dr. Williams explained in her final report. Typically, when an area experiences this level of positive transformation, it's accompanied by gentrification that pushes out long-term residents. But 27th Street has somehow managed to improve dramatically while maintaining its character and keeping its community intact. The secret, according to residents both old and new, was the presence that everyone could feel, but few could fully explain. Grace Santos had not only kept her promise to protect innocent people, she had somehow infused the entire neighborhood with a spiritual energy that made violence seem impossible and kindness feel natural. Daniel Richardson, now 43 years old and forever changed by his encounter with divine intervention, stood once again at the exact spot where his life had been saved. But this time, he wasn't alone. Surrounding him were hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Grace's continuing mission. Sarah Chen, the former addict who had become a nurse and now ran the shelter's medical clinic. Miguel Santos, Grace's younger brother, who had used his mechanical skills to start a job training program for homeless youth. Lena Santos, Grace's grandmother, whose weathered hands now blessed every new resident who entered the shelter doors. Father Miguel Rodriguez stood at the center of the gathering, preparing to dedicate the bronze statue that would forever mark the place where Grace Santos had chosen love over life, service over safety, and eternal purpose over temporal existence. The statue depicted Grace exactly as she had appeared on that miraculous night, her hand extended in protection, her eyes looking toward heaven, her face radiating the peace that had transformed everyone who encountered her presence. But it was the inscription at the base that captured the true meaning of her sacrifice. Grace Michelle Santos, Guardian Angel of 27th Street. She taught us that love is stronger than death, that courage is more powerful than fear, and that some promises are kept forever. As Father Rodriguez spoke the words of dedication, the January wind that had been blowing steadily all day suddenly stilled to perfect silence. The temperature, which had been below freezing, warmed perceptibly, and every person present reported feeling a presence that filled their hearts with indescribable peace. Daniel felt tears streaming down his face as he realized that Grace's mission had accomplished something far greater than saving individual lives. She had proven that one person's willingness to sacrifice everything for others could create ripples that would expand infinitely, touching hearts and changing lives across generations. The Grace Santos Foundation now operated in 47 cities across North America, each location reporting the same miraculous combination of practical success and spiritual transformation. Over 50,000 people had been housed, fed, and helped to rebuild their lives through programs that seemed to operate under divine protection. But the true measure of Grace's impact couldn't be counted in statistics or success rates. It could only be felt in the transformed hearts of people who had learned that angels walk among us, that miracles happen every day, and that death has no power over love that chooses to serve. If Grace Santos could keep her promise to protect innocent people even from beyond the grave, what promises are you willing to make with your own life? What guardian angel might you become for someone who desperately needs protection, hope, or simply the knowledge that they are not alone in this world? The story of the Angel of 27th Street reminds us that every act of selfless love creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see or measure. Grace's willingness to sacrifice everything for a stranger she had never met transformed not just Daniel Richardson's life, but thousands of lives across the world. Today, as you go about your daily routine, remember that you carry within yourself the same divine spark that made Grace Santos willing to step between danger and innocence. You have the power to be someone's miracle, someone's answered prayer, someone's guardian angel in human form. The question isn't whether miracles are real. Grace Santos proved they happen every day. The question is whether you're ready to become one.